Mr. Binger, it's yours.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to assure you that everything that the judge just read to you, you'll get a copy of, so you'll have a chance to look it over yourself. You don't have to memorize everything he just told you. I think it's no surprise that this is a case that there's a lot of noise and a lot of static surrounding it. So what I'd like to do at the beginning is crystallize it in a nutshell for you and keep it as simple as possible. This is a case in which a 17-year-old teenager killed 2 unarmed men and severely wounded a third person with an AR-15 that did not belong to him. This isn't a situation where he was protecting his home or his family. He killed people after traveling here from Antioch, Illinois, and staying out after a citywide curfew.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. There's no curfew charge anymore. There's no gun charge.
Although he claimed
there's no charge, but and there has been some discussion about the lawfulness of the curfew, not in this case, but elsewhere. So there had been a curfew announced. That does not mean that it was technically lawfully a legal curfew, but there had been an announced curfew. So I'll leave it at that.
And it was a curfew that all the rest of us here in Kenosha were aware of, and I think most people, most reasonable people, obeyed. Although the defendant claimed to be protecting a business that he wasn't familiar with, the actual killings in this case had nothing to do with that. And he also spent the entire evening lying about the fact that he was an EMT. None of the things that I just told you are in doubt in this case. So when we think about the defendant, I'd like you to consider, as you think about this case, what his true motivations were. Was this a situation where he sincerely cared about CarSource, even though he'd never heard of it, never bought anything there, never worked there, and not even its owners were out there that night protecting it? Was he genuinely interested in helping people? He ran around with an AR-15 all night and lied about being an EMT. Does that suggest to you that he genuinely is there to help? He's not there for the same purpose as the protesters. So why was he there that night? When you think about these things, I think there are some things that we can all agree on. In America, it's hard these days. People are polarized and there's a lot of political issues back and forth. And the judge has made it clear this case is not about politics. There is common ground here. We have all agreed, and I asked you this 2 weeks ago today. Raise your hand if you agree life is more important than property. And all of you raised your hand. We also agree that no one person's life is more valuable than another. You don't get to kill someone simply because they're a drug dealer. You don't weigh a pastor's life over a teacher's life. You don't weigh a police officer's life over an engineer's life. All life is sacred. I think we can also agree that we shouldn't have 17-year-olds running around our streets with AR-15s, because this is exactly what happens. And finally, I want you to keep in mind that we've all read stories and heard about heroes that step in to stop an active shooter or to give their life to save others. In fact, many people in Wisconsin went out and got carrying concealed weapon permits just so that they could be there in case there was an active shooter and wanting to stop them. So when you consider this case, look for the truth. So many people look at this case and they see what they want to see. They have a preconceived notion and they tailor the facts to fit whatever they believe. And you all agreed to keep an open mind. You all told us you didn't have any of those preconceived notions. Now you've heard the evidence, and it's time to search for the truth. So consider, for example, whether or not it's heroic or honorable to provoke and shoot unarmed people. Consider whether it makes someone a hero when they lie about being an EMT. I think all of us are familiar with someone who does the sorts of things that the defendant has done. They enjoy the thrill of going around and telling people what to do without the courage or the honor to back it up, and without the legal authority to do so. And when you think about the defendant's behavior in this case, contrast it with Anthony Huber. A man who was there because he knew Jacob Blake, who carried his skateboard everywhere, and who rushed towards danger to save other people's lives. So when I talk to you here in my closing argument, I'm going to focus first on the murders that the defendant committed. Second, I'm going to address some background issues, give you some context, and talk about some of the things that I don't think are relevant to this case. And finally, I'm going to tie it all into the jury instructions that the judge just gave you. As prosecutors in this case, my colleague Jim Krause and I have tried to present you with all of the relevant evidence that we think you should consider in this case. And I told one of you in jury selection that at the end of this, you would be the expert. You would have all the information. You would be the one who would know all about this case and make that decision. And that's what we've tried to do. So let's go to August 25th, 2020. The defendant came from outside our community, carrying a gun that wasn't his, because he expected and anticipated violence that night. And he pretended to guard what turned out to be an empty building owned by people he'd never even met, while fraudulently claiming all night long to be an EMT. There were a lot of people out that night. Some people stayed home protecting their homes and their families. Others went to their businesses, boarded them up, and protected them. And a lot of those people had weapons. A lot of them had guns. There were other people who came along to protect Car Source or Ultimate Gas or other businesses. And many of them were armed with AR-15s, just like the defendant. In fact, you're going to see a video, and you've already seen it, of a clash between people with AR-15s at Ultimate Gas and other folks that are, I guess, protesters. And there's people getting in people's faces. There's yelling, there's shouting, there's even shoving. And yet, in this entire sequence of events, from the shooting of Jacob Blake on Sunday, August 23rd, 2020, all the way after that, everything this community went through, the only person who shot and killed anyone was the defendant. Yes, there was property damage. No one's here to defend that. No one's here to tell you it's okay to commit arson or looting. No one's here to tell you it's okay to be rioters. I'm not defending any of that. You know, because you've been told in the testimony, I'm prosecuting Joseph Ziminskis for arson. That's not okay. But what you don't get to do is kill someone on the street for committing arson. So let's keep that in mind when we're talking about the people involved in this case. So let's begin with the provocation and the murder of Joseph Rosenbaum, because it's all captured on video. As the defendant and Mr. Rosenbaum arrive at the 63rd Street Car Source, Mr. Rosenbaum is ahead of the defendant. And as you see in the FBI video, when Mr. Rosenbaum starts to run, the defendant starts to run as well, at the same time, as if he's pursuing him. Mr. Rosenbaum could not have possibly have known the defendant is behind him. There's no indication in this record that he knew the defendant was there. It's not an ambush. It's not a situation where he goes there and lays in wait for the defendant. The defendant arrives at that location, and you hear him yell, "Friendly, friendly, friendly," because he's aware of the fact that the people that he's about to confront are hostile to him. And I'm going to show you in a moment the video in which the first thing he does when he arrives at that location is drops the fire extinguisher that he's holding in his left hand so he can raise the gun with his right and left hands and point it. This is when you hear someone, I think the testimony is Rosenbaum, it's not clear to me, but either way, yell, "Gun, gun, gun." And then Mr. Rosenbaum charges around to try and stop the defendant from pointing his gun or shooting anyone. So let's take a look at some of that video. This is Exhibit 73, the full drone video. And as we've pointed out to you before, and Jim will point out to you here in a second on the screen, when the defendant originally arrives at that scene, the first thing you see him do is drop the fire extinguisher and point his weapon at people. And then the chase occurs right after that. And you're going to see that entire sequence of events here on the full drone video. The defendant turns as he's being pursued and points the gun at Mr. Rosenbaum. And then as he enters the area between the parked cars, he slows and turns, and before Mr. Rosenbaum can even come close, he fires at him, shooting and knocking him to the ground. Now I'm going to show you the slowed down and zoomed in video of the defendant when he first gets there. And Mr. Krause is going to help me by directing your attention on the larger screen here to exactly where you will see the defendant. I'm going to replay it a few times so you can see quite clearly that the defendant sets the fire extinguisher on the ground with his left hand and then brings his left hand over to the gun and raises it and points. Guys, check the gun. Make sure it's empty. Under Wisconsin law, you're not allowed to run around and point your gun at people. This is the provocation. This is what starts this incident. The defendant rushes in and immediately points the gun. And as you'll see in a little bit, Mr. Rosenbaum doesn't take kindly to people pointing guns. I don't think anyone does. That's not unusual. No one wants to have the gun pointed at them, and no one wants to watch anyone else do this to someone else. We have the gun. It is in evidence as exhibit number 28. I'm having the detectives check it to make sure that it is safe. The defendant comes running in and drops the fire extinguisher on the ground like this. And then raises his left hand to the gun and points. This is what we see in the video. Him putting the fire extinguisher on the ground and then raising the gun.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. He's facing the wrong direction.
That's an argument.
Okay.
I'd like to actually have, well, I'll leave it alone.
So what you see in that video is his left arm reaching for the gun, holding it up. You can see it again on the video here. His left arm reaching up towards the gun. That is what provokes this entire incident. And one of the things to keep in mind is that when the defendant provokes the incident, he loses the right to self-defense. You cannot claim self-defense against a danger you create. That's critical right here. If you're the one who is threatening others, you lose the right to claim self-defense. Then we have the chase that occurs after that. And we have taken that drone video and we have slowed down portions of that chase for you. So what we have right here on the screen, this is Exhibit 84, and this is the middle portion of that incident. And you can see Mr. Rosenbaum chasing after the defendant, throwing that plastic bag, and then the defendant turns and points the gun back at Mr. Rosenbaum. And this is the moment in time when Mr. Rosenbaum essentially does sort of a little hop with both of his hands in the air. And the defendant has testified. He saw at that moment that there was nothing in the defendant's hand, or in Mr. Rosenbaum's hands. He was unarmed. There's the defendant turning and pointing the gun. Mr. Rosenbaum leaps, his hands out to the air, and then watch here at the end. This is where the shooting occurs. Mr. Rosenbaum is not even within arm's reach when the first shot occurs. I'll play that again. The defendant is pointing the gun at Mr. Rosenbaum. Mr. Rosenbaum raises his arms off to the side. The defendant approaches these cars and slows down, and then turns and shoots Mr. Rosenbaum. Finally, I'm going to play you Exhibit 86. This shows you the final part of that, zoomed in and slowed down. Here's the defendant running in between those parked cars, slowing down, and you can see just how close, or rather how far away, Mr. Rosenbaum was when the defendant shot him. You can see from this video that Mr. Rosenbaum is not even within arm's reach of the defendant when the first shot goes off. The defendant fires 4 shots in quick succession. And I'll come back to this in a moment, but you'll note during this entire sequence, it's the defendant who chooses where to go. He's the one who decides to run where he runs. And he slows down right as he gets to these parked cars. That's what allows Rosenbaum to get closer. We've seen this on the aerial footage from the FBI, and I want you to see that perspective as well. This is Exhibit 25. This is the annotated aerial footage. You see the defendant approach, running in the same direction as Mr. Rosenbaum. This is where the pointing occurs in the direction of the Ziminskis. You can see Joshua Ziminskis right there on the screen. I'm going to put the cursor over where the Ziminskis are. They're right in there. The defendant is pointing his gun right here, and he's pointing it in the direction of the Ziminskis, because they're standing next to that car. And then the chase occurs. Now what's interesting to me is watch when the crowd starts to run. The crowd's already starting to run here even before the defendant has fired a shot. That's likely because they heard the first shot from Joshua Ziminski, and the crowd starts to run away. The defendant has testified that that shot from Mr. Ziminski had nothing to do with his decision to kill Joseph Rosenbaum. And I'll come back to that in a second. Finally, I'm going to show you this incident from the perspective of Drew Hernandez, because he is behind all of this, and then he comes upon Mr. Rosenbaum's body. Is that audio playing? Where's the audio not playing? Is it coming? I'm not sure why you're not hearing any audio on that. Is Brian around? He's not. All right. Can you text Brian, please? At any rate, for this purpose, I'm sorry? At this point, the defendant has shot and killed Joseph Rosenbaum, and Mr. Rosenbaum is laying face down. That's where he falls. Richie McGinnis actually rolls him over after trying to stem the bleeding here. You can see in the foreground that plastic bag that Mr. Rosenbaum threw on the ground. I don't think there's any dispute. There was nothing harmful in that bag. It was a clear bag containing some clear items.
Objection. There is a dispute what's in that bag.
Then you can make that dispute in your argument.
It's argument, and you'll be allowed to respond.
You can see in this video the crowd is attempting to save Mr. Rosenbaum's life. So, we have shown you the defendant murdering Joseph Rosenbaum from 3 different angles. The drone footage, Drew Hernandez, and also the FBI video. The defendant admitted that during this entire incident, he knew that Joseph Rosenbaum was unarmed. I'm going to come back to this in a little while, but there's this alleged threat that Mr. Rosenbaum made earlier in the evening to kill the defendant. I will debunk that. That did not happen. It is the one fact in this case the defendant wants you to believe that there's no video of. And in fact, I have the video of the entire incident. I've played it for you and I'll show it to you again. There's no threat. There's also no evidence that Mr. Rosenbaum ever wanted the defendant's gun. He never said, "I'm going to take your gun." He never said, "I want your gun." There's no indication of that. Dr. Kelly has testified that the first shot that the defendant fired at Joseph Rosenbaum hit the victim in the right pelvis, fracturing it. Mr. Rosenbaum was incapacitated at that point. He is, whatever threat he might have posed, it's over. There is no further threat. He is falling to the ground, and the defendant doesn't stop after that first shot. He tracks Mr. Rosenbaum's body all the way down, firing 3 more shots. A second shot, which goes through Mr. Rosenbaum's hand, and then a third and fourth shot, one that grazes the right scalp and one that goes right into Mr. Rosenbaum's back. And that is the kill shot. That is the one that took Mr. Rosenbaum's life. There is no evidence that Mr. Rosenbaum was reaching for the defendant's gun. And after that first shot, there's no way Mr. Rosenbaum could have taken that gun even if he wanted to. He is already falling to the ground. He is helpless. He is vulnerable. And as I said, the kill shot is the one to the back. This is that wound. Dr. Kelly testified that the angle of this shot was from the left shoulder towards the center of the back, and the bullet continued on down towards the right lower back area, tearing through bodily organs and killing Mr. Rosenbaum. Here's a picture of the wound to the hand. There's been a lot of testimony about this wound. This is one in which the evidence suggests that Mr. Rosenbaum's hand was most likely turned in this position, palms outward with his thumb to the ground, when the wound, the bullet goes through the area in between his middle finger and his ring finger and penetrates the lower knuckle of the middle finger and the index finger before exiting. Dr. Kelly testified there's soot in that area, suggesting that the hand was close to the end of the defendant's barrel of the AR-15 at the time of that shot. The defense wants you to believe it's there because Mr. Rosenbaum is deliberately reaching for the gun. Well, that doesn't make any sense. First of all, this occurs after Mr. Rosenbaum has been shot in the hip and has got a fractured pelvis at that point. He is falling. He is not able to walk. He's probably not even able to control much of his movements at this point. When you're reaching for that gun, this is not the way you're going to do it. This is not going to be effective. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, to the extent Mr. Rosenbaum's hand ever got close to the end of the defendant's gun, it was completely inadvertent, not at all intentional. Now, we've heard a lot about the Ziminskis in this case, and I just want to carve them out of this case right now because it's a red herring. It has nothing to do with any of this. There's been some focus on that because I think the defense was hoping they could work this into their self-defense claim and make an argument that that first shot by Joshua Ziminski somehow made the defendant fear for his life. Unfortunately, The defendant wasn't on board with that, because in his testimony, he told you that that shot had nothing to do with his thought process. It didn't affect him in any way. He said he didn't think the shot came from Joseph Rosenbaum. He knew Joseph Rosenbaum was unarmed, and he admitted to me, you can't kill Joseph Rosenbaum for something Joshua Ziminski did. So let's just carve Joshua Ziminski out of this case. I'll deal with him on his arson trial in January, but until then, it doesn't factor into any of the decisions the defendant made. And in fact, as you see on the FBI video, the Ziminskis continue walking straight on down the sidewalk. They don't pursue the defendant. They don't threaten the defendant in any way. Now, the defense wants you to think Joseph Rosenbaum was there to attack the defendant. We'll never know what Joseph Rosenbaum was thinking because the defendant killed him. So we're just guessing. But let's assume for a minute, yeah, Joseph Rosenbaum is chasing after the defendant because he wants to do some physical harm to him. He's an unarmed man. This is a bar fight. This is a fist fight. This is a fight that maybe many of you have been involved in. Two people, hand to hand, we're throwing punches, we're pushing, we're shoving, we're whatever. But what you don't do is you don't bring a gun to a fist fight. What the defendant wants you to believe is that because he's the one who brought the gun, he gets to kill. So I want you to contrast this, two different scenarios. One scenario where there's two guys who are throwing punches at one another like a bar fight. I think we'd all agree you can't kill someone. You can't punch the guy, knock him to the ground, and then get on him and strangle the life out of him. That's murder. So what's the difference here? The only difference is the defendant brought a gun. He brought his AR-15. That's why he's got to come up with this cockamamie theory that Joseph Rosenbaum was not only going to take the gun, but take it and then turn it on the defendant. And the defendant actually told you that he thought Joseph Rosenbaum was going to take that gun and not only kill him, but kill other people, which is really ironic considering the defendant is the one who killed people in this case, and the only one. But putting that aside, they have to convince you that Joseph Rosenbaum was going to take that gun and use it on the defendant because they know you can't claim self-defense against an unarmed man like this. You lose the right to self-defense when you're the one who brought the gun, when you're the one creating the danger, when you're the one provoking other people. The defendant fired 4 shots at Joseph Rosenbaum and caused 5 wounds total. The first shot fractured Joseph Rosenbaum's pelvis. This causes him to be helpless. He is falling face first to the ground and he is vulnerable. The second shot went through his left hand, probably ricocheted off the ground and hit his lower left thigh. It's a flesh wound. I'm sure it hurt, but probably not all that serious. The third and fourth shots are as Mr. Rosenbaum has fallen almost completely to the ground. He's parallel to the ground. He is almost face first to the ground. The defendant fires a round into his upper back, which is the kill shot, and another round which grazes his right scalp. At this point, as you saw in that video, a crowd rushes to that body to try and save Joseph Rosenbaum. They're trying to put clothing on the wound to stop the bleeding. They're going to take him across the street to a hospital. KMH, Frederick South, is literally right across the street. And this crowd, except for the defendant, are all focused on trying to save this person's life. A person, by the way, they probably had never even met before. Because that's what most people do. Richie McGinnis testified. I rode with Rosenbaum in the back of that SUV. I told him we'd have a beer together when this was all done. Mr. Rosenbaum was unable to respond. The defendant decided to pull the trigger on his AR-15 4 times. That was his decision. And he is responsible for every bullet that comes out of that gun. He doesn't get a pass by pulling the trigger fast. He could have chosen to stop after the first shot, after the second shot, after the third shot. and assessed whether or not there was still a need to keep firing. But he went 4 times in 0.76 seconds. The defense has made a big point of this, how fast he fired, as if that somehow excuses him. Exactly the opposite, ladies and gentlemen. He controls how quickly he pulls the trigger. He is in control of that decision-making process. No one else made him do that. And this is indicative of someone who doesn't care about the consequences, doesn't care to stop and figure out, am I good? Do I need to stop? Or I'm just going to keep on going. And as I said, he tracks the body all the way to the ground with those second, third, and fourth shots. The only way that you could possibly justify the murder of Joseph Rosenbaum is if you believe that Joseph Rosenbaum was actually reaching for the defendant's gun, and that a reasonable person in the defendant's position with that AR-15 strapped tightly to his chest would think that Joseph Rosenbaum was even capable of taking that gun away as he's falling to the ground with a fractured right pelvis. And then, not only all that, you'd also have to believe that Joseph Rosenbaum was going to turn that gun around and use it to kill the defendant. You have to believe all of those things to justify the murder of Joseph Rosenbaum. That's why the defense is trying so desperately hard to convince you that Joseph Rosenbaum threatened to kill the defendant, which never happened. That's why they're trying so desperately hard to convince you that Joseph Rosenbaum was reaching for that gun. Because if he's not reaching for that gun, and he's not going to use it to kill the defendant, it is not justified. There is no valid self-defense claim. One of the things the judge has instructed you is that when the defendant provokes this situation, he has to exhaust all reasonable means to avoid killing someone. Did he? He didn't have to shoot. He's the one who chose where to run. He chose to run in between those parked cars. He slows down as he gets there. The crowd's already running away. The defense wants to make a point. There's a whole bunch of people over there who are doing stuff to cars, and the defendant had no escape route. The crowd's actually already running away at this point. They've heard the first gunshot from Joshua Ziminskis, and they're already starting to scatter. But if you look on the video, there's a huge open space in that lot where the defendant could have circled back around, and he actually does circle back around after killing Rosenbaum, where he could have gotten away. He has to exhaust all reasonable means of escape before killing Mr. Rosenbaum. Your Honor, I do have some more video I want to play. I'm having a little bit of technical problems that I'd like to work on, so I think this would be a good time to pause, if that's okay. Okay, thank you.
All right. Please don't talk about the case during the break. Read, watch, or listen to any account. And we will begin again at... It's 1:45 too soon?
Did you say 12:45 or 1:45?
Oh, well, I thought we'd tell it leisurely. No, how about 12:45? Is that a better idea? Let's do that. Please don't talk about the case.
Well, there we have some of the state's closing argument. Many of us here at headquarters were surprised that this prosecutor was okay with having his arguments interrupted with the jury's lunch break. So when they come back, they'll hear the remainder of the state's closing argument. Then, of course, it's time for the defense closing arguments.